people.
Another of our things, so to speak, right now as we speak, the idea of sexuality and choosing to control it. So the Catholicism, major religion, no condoms, please. Again, from the aspect of the gender intellectual or the intellectual on gender, a comment.
Well, I say no condoms, please, is a very careless position to take in a world in which the HIV/AIDS pandemic is wreaking havoc. That's like giving a death sentence to people who will have sexual
They're saying,
relations.
control yourself, dear. Don't go out there.
Well, ABC, I've
yes,
heard about it, the ABC
right.
recipe.
Right, and a recipe that was dished out by George Bush, was it senior or junior, for the whole of the continent, with lots of dollars attached to it.
And it cost thousands of lives.
A mistake, therefore, in your view.
A very bad mistake, and we should ask why George Bush is advocating an agenda like that in Africa, when my experience of the United States is there's a much higher level of sexual freedom, if you want to call it that. There's much more, it's much more lenient than the majority of African societies. On the whole, contrary to what the West would like to say about us, I find our societies are relatively controlled and restrained, not through religion partly, but also just morally and ethically. I think there's a portrayal that we're all licentious, but it's not actually true. Some Africans are, some other people are too. It's a misrepresentation.
Let's switch religions and go to Islam, which again is a let's not go sort of Christian bashing. One could argue, Professor, that Islam is even more stringent in its demands upon women in a way that would irk you, to say the least.
Well, given that I grew up in a Muslim culture, I'm happy to share the fact that there are a lot of Muslim women who are engaging in the discussion with the imams and studying the Quran and arguing that the received prescriptions coming from the mosques and the imams are not the full picture. And the most powerful feminists I know in northern Nigeria are very good, staunch Muslim women who study the texts and engage with their male counterparts on this territory. So it's not a resolved issue. It's a site of struggle, just as within Christianity. And you have very strong advocates for full rights. And in fact, I know personally Muslim women who converted from Christianity on the basis that there are tenets within Islam that give women more freedom. And I could give you some examples. But one of them that my friends and colleagues have often cited is the fact that under Islam, a woman is entitled to sexual satisfaction. And it is a basis for divorce if her husband fails to honor that duty to his wife. And we don't have that in Christianity. So in a way you could, and this is what my Muslim sisters would argue, is that Islam allows more fullness to women than the Bible and than Christianity, which is very strict.
Yes. Another local female genital mutilation, FGM, and now the African societies arguing that practice this. We have always been thus. This is part of our identity, and it's the aping the white man's ways, taking all the way down to the Hollywood portrayal of romantic love. This is a prescriptive notion of love, and we should stay the way we've always been, our forefathers and foremothers before us.
Well, the term female genital mutilation predefines the answer to that. So I think...
As in mutilation...
Well, as in mutilating. And
yes.
I'd like to put it in a more global context and say that, you know, we have certain practices in Africa, and I can think of practices in the West where they also have historically practiced clitoridectomy, for example, up until the 1950s as a treatment for mental disturbance. So it's not only in Africa. However, the conditions under which such surgeries are performed are very different. But I think the counterpart to what the West labels and it's a broad spectrum of practices and traditions that they label as female genital mutilation, what would the counterpart be in the West? And I'm thinking of all the different kinds of surgery that women have in the name of being beautiful and being attractive to men, in augmenting femininity. And you can go from very dangerous practices like breast implants to various forms of surgery closer to what you've just mentioned. So it's not just an African thing to tamper with your natural endowment. I think it's important that as Africans we're not defensive. If we decide to change something about our society because it's no longer serving a useful purpose, it's damaging health, it's making childbirth difficult for women, then we should be courageous enough to do that and not be afraid of whatever. Does the white man really care what we do to women's bodies? I doubt it. They can't care as much as we do. And my thing on that would be to argue that women are mobilizing themselves with the help of certain men. I don't know if you've seen Sembene Usman's film on the subject. One of his last film, I believe, is on that subject, showing how women at village level are organizing to change this practice because it is no longer useful.
Enough of local concerns. Your lecture, Global Militarism and the Resilience of Women in Africa. It was a long lecture. Would I be so flippant as to ask you to summarize it in some form in a couple of minutes?
I can summarize.
The concerns of the moment.
I'll give it a shot. I mean, the title says what it's about. So it's looking at the global context in which the human race is spending more on military equipment, arsenals, armies, weapons of mass destruction than at any time in human history. So that's the global picture. Now, the key leader in that is, of course, the United States of America, which is responsible for very nearly 50% of the world's expenditure. So the reason I raise that is because it's the global policy and political and ideological context in which I chose to discuss the question of how African societies have been resilient despite the global history of conquest, colonization, enslavement, and so on. So the survival of large numbers of African people despite that history interests me. And the argument I was making in the lecture is that one of the key features, one of the key enabling factors in the survival of African people has been the formerly hidden and invisibilized labor of African women. Even now, right through to current day conflicts, women are still growing food, distributing food, keeping alive networks of community that sustain ravaged communities as they flee from place to place, as they're affected by conflict. So, in other words, the secret of Africa's survival very much, I think, we can locate in the work that women do and have always done, which has been essential to the survival of our societies and was often overlooked by, if you like, first-generation models of development.
Would you go a step further and say that in this argument about the African Renaissance, the economic statistics, are women again going to be the great motors of this Renaissance?
Well, it's an interesting question you've asked. The statistic that is being so widely celebrated by our presidents in this recent 50-year anniversary is actually the gross domestic product. Now, the calculations of gross domestic product actually exclude most women's work, because most women in Africa work in the informal sector, in these subaltern networks that are critical to our survival, but which the global market really has no interest in. So that's the argument I'm developing in that lecture, that we need to take it seriously, particularly because women are no longer invisible and women's work is up for grabs. If Fortune 100 magazine describes women as the world's next largest emerging market, and African presidents are very excited about this, what is it going to mean for us as women who have always worked, who have always, I would say, overworked? Because the way current politics and policies have gone has been to actually enhance women's workload. as we remove public health care and divest the public services that enable people to survive, the burden is being borne by women. So women are already multiply burdened since economic reform and the global policy dictates have made things worse. So I would say that covert infrastructure is in jeopardy when organizations like the World Bank and transnational corporations target African women for inclusion. We need to be extremely careful about the terms under which we're going to be further included, because we were never outside. We've just been playing a marginalized role. But if we're to be included, on whose terms and to whose advantage? Given the role we've played in Africa's regional survival and development, we need to confront this question head on now before those last networks are overutilized. Women's labor is not infinitely elastic. And I'm saying there's a problem because Africa is now the only continent in which women die younger than men. That's a biological aberration. And why is it? One of the arguments would be women are severely overburdened, and the withdrawal of state structures has burdened us further, so that role is now in jeopardy.
The last question, again, do forgive me if it's so empirical as to sound trite. What is the future of feminism in Africa?
Well, I think it's a great question. It's not going away. Part of the work that scholars do is track the long history of feminism throughout the 20th century. In Egypt in the 1920s, there was a feminist union, and one could track. So we can draw a feminist history, which is what I would like to do before projecting a feminist future. If you look at what the concern of feminism is, which is basically social justice for women as well as for men, then ideally the future would be that it would no longer be necessary. Because we would have achieved freedom, we would have achieved a basically just and democratic society that includes women alongside men and doesn't rely on dynamics of oppression and exploitation and subordination that, as I say, have not worked in Africa's interests. Our region cannot afford this nonsense. That is what we have adopted from the colonizers who came from deeply patriarchal and militarized Victorian societies. So the future is bright. We've got lots of work to do, but the ultimate future should be to render feminism and the struggles of women for freedom irrelevant.
Professor Amina Mama, feminist intellectual, thank you very much for coming on the JSO interview.
My absolute pleasure.